The Something You Should Know podcast is sponsored by Audible.com. For your free audiobook download and free 30-day trial to their service, just go to audibletrial.com/SYSK for Something You Should Know. It's audibletrial.com/SYSK. Today on Something You Should Know, good news if you're thinking of changing careers. Having experience and paying your dues may not only be unnecessary, it may not even be desirable. Also, we live in a world full of rules. To what you can take on an airplane, to what your child can wear. Are all these rules really making us safer?
In fact, far from it. We've found that some of these safety and security rules are actually making us more at risk of other things. It just seems that when something has got a safety or a security label on it, people stop asking questions.
Plus, unruly airline passengers. What's the deal with them? And the amazing power of practicing just a little more kindness in the world.
That when you start to incorporate those simple things that do make a difference, you'll see how kindness really is contagious.
All this today on Something You Should Know.
Something you should know. Fascinating intel, the world's top experts, and practical advice you can use in your life today. The Something You Should Know podcast with Mike Carruthers.
Well, it is a good day around the podcast ranch today, and in part I have you to thank for that. On the iTunes podcast chart, which is basically the chart of record for podcasts, I woke up this morning and looked at this podcast, Something You Should Know, and it was ranked 11th in the category of society and culture and ranked 49th overall for all podcasts in iTunes. That was like waking up Christmas morning. That was so great to see. We've been working on this for a long time, and to have that happen is really great. And I owe it in part to you for listening, leaving a rating and review, which if you haven't done already, I'd really appreciate, and telling your friends and subscribing. And this is just great. So thank you very much. First up today on Something You Should Know, I want to talk about paying your dues. This is particularly important to maybe to older people who are looking, or anyone who's looking to have to change careers or industries. In our business culture, it's always been that you have to pay your dues. You have to get experience before you can be considered a real master at whatever it is you're trying to do. And while that may be true for physical work, like athletes and musicians and watchmakers and plumbers, it turns out to not be true for knowledge work. In research for her book, Rookie Smarts, Liz Wiseman discovered that rookies, people who don't know what they're doing, outperform people with experience in the areas of innovation and speed. And the reason is pretty obvious. Experienced people tend to think they know it already, whereas beginners are hungry and go out and learn and gather more expertise from the outside. And since they really don't know what they're doing and they don't know how things are supposed to work, they work in kind of scrappy, resourceful ways to get things done. With knowledge work, Liz says rookies only need about 30 hours of experience to get to the level they need to perform well. And that is something you should know. Lord knows we have a lot of rules. We have rules for everything. And at first glance, you'd think, well, rules are good. They keep us safe. But wait a minute. Do they really? Are you really safer because people can't take liquids on a plane? I mean, come on. This is the topic for discussion today with Tracey Browne. She's the author of a book called Playing by the Rules. And she's looked a little deeper into this than just that feel-good feeling you get that you think, well, we have rules to keep us safe. Well, there's more to it than that. So, Tracey, what's your conclusion, having done this research? Do these rules make us safer?
I'm afraid our conclusion is that there isn't a great deal that is making it safer when it has a safety label. In fact, far from it. We've found that some of these safety and security rules are actually making us more at risk of other things. So that's a really interesting discovery. It just seems that when something has got a safety or a security label on it, people stop asking questions. They stop asking, is this actually doing anything to make us safer?
So give me some examples of things that seemingly we accept and have no benefit.
Okay, so one of the things is obviously all those things that TSA don't allow us to take when we board an airplane. And we assume that there must be some reasonable possibility that someone could, for example, use those outsized shampoo bottles, fill them up with stuff and make a bomb in the airplane bathroom. We assume someone somewhere must have actually been able to achieve this. And similarly with all the other sort of stuff that they say we can't take on board, there seems to be some sort of background to it. We were very surprised to find that it's near impossible to make a bomb in the airplane bathroom with the kind of stuff that people are worrying about. If you had a concentration of hydrogen peroxide that intense, it would be so unstable, you'd be very unlikely to make it to the aircraft door. On the other hand, you can go straight through airport security, buy yourself a bottle of overproof whiskey, you can carry a lighter on board. And it seems rather strange that you're allowed to do that because it suits the duty-free, but you're not allowed to take anything more than 3 ounces with your shampoo.
Well, somebody must have had some reason for that in the first. There must have been some basis for that, or did they just pull it out of thin air?
Well, a lot of this it starts with something. There was an attempt to create a bomb on a plane, but it wasn't a likely successful attempt. So what happened was that it took, I think, 30 attempts and 4 weeks of the top government scientists trying to use what these would-be terrorists had been hoping to use to create a bomb, and it took many, many hours. So obviously most planes will have landed by the time you've been in there in the bathroom with your ice, keeping it all at 10 degrees, because if it goes any higher than that, you would inhale the fumes and die. Keeping it all really 10 degrees, you'd be in there 3 hours, 4 hours, hopefully no one knocking on the bathroom door wondering what on earth you're up to. And then you'd have to have another sort of few hours to dry it out into some sort of a powder. So, yeah, there is a tenuous link. The thing is, of course, people feel, we sort of live in this age where people feel something must be done. And that's not just about possible public outrages, terrorism incidents, gun sprees. It's also about, people feeling that something must be done in relation to child protection. If there are any of these very unusual, really highly unusual circumstances where children are abducted and killed, it's very, very rare. But again, there's this feeling that something must be done. We must have some new measure put in place that will mean that won't ever happen again or can't happen. And it becomes almost a kind of talisman. The fact that it isn't really ever likely to work doesn't really come into the question.
So the response to that might be that, well, but if it saves one child, if in an abundance of caution we're doing this because you just don't know, as you said, it's unlikely you could make a bomb, but unlikely is not 100%. So this just makes sure that you know what I'm saying. So what's your response to that?
Sure, but we need to be very careful here because what happens is when you stop looking at what are the unintended consequences of introducing rules, you stop looking at the lives it might ruin. So, and I'm quite serious about this. It's not a rhetorical point. If you have rules that stop families from taking more than 2 children, or in some cases even 2 children under the age of 8 swimming in a public pool, because of fear that this would increase the risk of a child not being supervised and therefore drowning. And there are no under 8s drowning in public pools as a result of parents having twins or 2 young children and taking them both swimming. There just are not the incidents to deal with. But, there's a theoretical possibility it saves one life. But there's also a pretty convincing possibility that families not going swimming and getting children particularly getting them used to cold water and cold water shock at a young age, are not producing teenagers who can cope with falling into rivers and lakes. And that is a real thing that happens because teenagers do die from falling into rivers and lakes.
Yeah. Well.
So, these things are trade-offs, So when we introduce something in the name of safety, sometimes we're introducing things which actually put us at risk of other things. So a good example of that is also quite a well-known one that after 9/11, and continued for many years after 9/11, because of all the restrictions that were put in place, among other things, people took to the roads. well, the roads are a much more unsafe place to travel, and as a result, you saw a direct correlation in the spike in road incidents and deaths.
It fascinates me that compared to when I was a kid, I mean, everything is a potential danger. And, maybe some of this is good. When I was a kid, we didn't have seat belts. We didn't, or if we had them, we didn't have to use them, and now we do. And that's a good thing. But my God, I mean, every little thing now is regulated, and just because there's just this outside chance that somebody thinks that maybe possibly one day something bad might happen. It's nuts.
Yeah, and Mike, you're absolutely right to point out seatbelts. The interesting thing about the seatbelts argument is that it was won by hard evidence. So people analysed what was causing the severity and the fatalities in car accidents, and as a result of that, there were experiments introducing seatbelts. The results of those experiments showed that people were much less damaged by the collisions that did happen, and the seatbelt argument got won that way. It got won with evidence. It's very different from the kind of things that you're talking about. And, you raise a really important point here. I kind of hear behind your question the concern that it's not just a question of whether stuff makes us safe, but it's also the other stuff they might be damaging. That childhood no longer seems this fun place to be, and that raising a family is all about, risk assessment and safety measures rather than actually exploring the world and learning how to cope with those risks and find the opportunities.
Is there any sense or any evidence that the world is a much dangerous place than it was 30 years ago?
It's going the opposite way, and this is what is so frustrating, and one of the reasons why I felt such an urge to write this book, because I really do want citizens to stand up and start asking questions, because we have got this fantastic legacy of safety. As you said, children now are belted up in the back of the car. We don't have playgrounds with this really hard concrete that people smash their heads on. There are some really good measures. There are just so many things, that our children are less likely to be involved in wars, less likely to be harmed on the streets. So many things that they have better options for than we ever had and the previous generations did. And yet we live in such anxious times. Why can we not claim that legacy? It seems that we need to kind of relax a bit and start asking some questions about what risks really are.
You mentioned last time we talked there was a case of somebody letting their child walk to soccer practice for a block. Tell that story.
So playing by the rules is not just the story of mine and my co-authors' journeys, trying to find the evidence and contacting all the authorities to ask them for it. It was also the story of many people across America doing a similar thing. We, along the way, found great heroes. For example, one mum who allowed her son at the age of 10 to walk a few blocks to soccer practice, only to find that someone called 911. And now most of us would be really intimidated by that because a cop showed up at soccer practice and ranted at her and raged at her. But her reaction was fantastic. She wasn't intimidated. She went home and she phoned the chief of police in her town and said, "Where's your evidence that our town is really so dangerous that I can't let my 10-year-old walk just 20 minutes ahead of me to soccer practice?" And he had to admit there was none. And in fact, that actually led to her running a big campaign to get kids playing outside more and get parents to be more aware of what the risks are of abduction and kids off the street and that kind of thing. And in fact, she noticed that there were many roads, many streets where there were no sidewalks because so few kids were playing outside that in fact a very dangerous thing had happened was that nobody bothered to build a sidewalk on some streets.
What you said earlier is so true, this thinking that, when something bad happens, we must do something and we must apply it to everyone. And it makes people feel better because they feel like, well, we've really done something now. And yet there's not much evidence to support the fact that going forward, that thing has any effect.
That's the crucial question. We really do need, as citizens, to get our politicians and our rule makers to ask the question, is there a pattern? Is there a pattern? We need to make them aware that we as citizens expect them to take a pause for breath and ask that question. Never mind that the newspaper headlines are screaming. They really need on our behalf to ask that question, and they won't do it unless we ask that too. Is there a pattern? And if there is a pattern, and we might do something to stop it, then are we sure that the thing we're proposing to do will actually influence that pattern? You know, one of the things we do just have to accept is that there are some things that don't have a pattern, like those random events of very unusual child abduction and murder, and we just cannot predict them. Any measure that people could dream up and tell you, this is a great way to spot the person who's going to do it, this is a great way to spot the situation where it's likely to happen, they're just not telling the truth. All of the evidence that we can find, and there have been some fantastic studies, show that this is pretty much a random event and there's no predictability.
And, you know, things happen. I mean, there's no way to guarantee. I mean, a piano could fall on your head tomorrow. Things happen. They just do.
Things do happen. Things happen, but also good things happen as well. Good things happen as a result of us going out into the world and experiencing it, especially when we're talking about allowing our kids some freedom to engage with it. And I think, you know, one of the problems is that we don't count what it is that children are losing when they're wrapped up and kept at home.
I wonder if this is all kind of part of, and I've had this discussion before, it's kind of like, you know, when you have a government, the government feels the necessity to keep passing laws. And so there's always going to be more laws. And the more laws there are, the more restrictive life gets. But they're never going to say, you know, that's enough. That's enough. And we don't need any more laws. So it's the same thing here where we need to make kids safer. We need to make things safer. We need to put more stickers on the stepladder because maybe it's because there's this belief somewhere that people are just really stupid and that they don't even know what's good for them or what's bad for them.
In the book, we looked into the question of the politics of it all. And one of the things we noticed was that the closer you are to an election, the more likely it is that you're going to get this kind of knee-jerk response. In fact, we tracked various political leaders who were initially very calm in response to a serious public incident, and we showed how actually, as the closer it got to their re-election, that changed. And I think what that tells you is that this is not a given. You know, what they're trying to do, of course, is to get favour from particular groups by responding. But if we make it clear that we as citizens do not expect our politicians and our lawmakers to react at the drop of a hat, the latest thing, then I think we're going to get a different response from them. At the moment, the pressures all seem to be going one way. And I'm not talking about go off to university and make yourself into a statistician and start taking issue with all this. I'm saying that if all of us, once in a while, instead of shrugging our shoulders at something that doesn't make sense, ask the question, then these things would stop becoming, you know, a sort of a free pass. If you say safety or security, or it's for your own security, it stops being a free pass. It becomes a slightly more difficult and uncomfortable thing for people to do, and they will have to justify themselves. It just takes all of us doing that once in a while to really change how I think the pressure that there is coming the other way to say, no, stop and think.
But isn't the comeback to that, which is hard to argue, well, don't you want our kids to be safe? Well, sure, but that doesn't mean what you're suggesting will. Yes, but, you know, it couldn't hurt and it might help.
Well, the other danger is that when everything is about safety, then we start losing sight of the real important stuff, you know, because I'll give you an example. Pregnant women are absolutely bombarded with information now about what is safe for their unborn baby. And, you know, it's about everything. They can't go to the pool because they might inhale the chemicals, never mind whether or not they're getting any benefits from swimming. You know, all sorts of things to do with putting plastics in their microwave and what they should eat, what they shouldn't eat, and cheese and all sorts of different things that they're warned about. Now, there are some really important bits of information to get across to pregnant women, and that is that folic acid does hugely improve the outcomes of their pregnancy and how to spot early signs of preeclampsia, which is a condition that is not good for either mother or baby. Now, those are two really important messages, but if they become two messages among 300, how are we sure that people are going to hear them? So it's not a case that just stacking up these messages and talking about safety on everything really helps us. It means we lose the ability to alert people to things that really do need to be taken notice of.
But do you think it might be just too late for this? I mean, is it too late to stop the momentum of this?
I think it's hard. I agree it's hard, and I think in some areas it's particularly difficult in kids' sports. I think it's really difficult to do now. But I do think that there are so many great examples in our book of people who ask the question and stop something in its tracks. Sometimes, they've had to really work hard to get that question heard. So in the case of taking children swimming, the hero of that story, she just took it further and further. She went to the pool, she went to the local authorities that govern the pool, she went to the professional body that informs, she went to the insurers, everywhere. She was great and really pushed it through. But there are other stories where people just asked a simple question and put the sense of accountability back on the person proposing the rule. Because you know how that feels like. If someone says to you, well, it's for safety, you feel like that puts you under the spotlight. Well, who am I to say it's not? Am I the friend of the pedophile? Am I the friend of terrorism? If I'm going to question this. But if you say, where's the evidence? I just want to see the evidence. That puts the onus back on them to come up with it. And I think we can do a lot to push that back and to stop feeling so intimidated and start listening. We all have this inner voice telling us that some of this stuff just really does not make sense. And we need to start listening to that inner voice.
Yeah, well, what you said earlier about what I said about the seatbelts, that there was some evidence, and maybe because another thing in recent years has been, let the siren go by, has been football, head injuries in football, and the kids shouldn't be playing football, and now there really is some evidence that maybe that's true, but up until the evidence, it was just I don't know what it was, but there again. Go ahead.
There are some things where in life we might choose to take certain risks. Horse riding is a really dangerous sport. Football's a dangerous sport. Skiing is dangerous. There are some things relative to other things, and there are some things where we choose to take certain risks. And so long as we know what they are, we can make those choices. And we can make decisions about how much we want to allow rules to influence those. The problem we have is with so many of these things is that they're not being introduced in respect to the evidence. And at least as you say, in those discussions about football, there is a conversation about the evidence. Right? Most of the time, we don't even see a conversation. Somebody just thinks, this is a really good idea to put up a notice. One of the other issues I'm finding in kids' sports is that people are being appointed to have these roles like, child protection officer in maybe a junior soccer league. And what happens is they then need to find something to do. So they start sending emails and they start looking for training courses for the coaches. And these, guys who are volunteers who suddenly it becomes not so fun anymore because they've got to go on all these courses and they've got to have all these checks and so on. And, people start saying, I've got a busy day job. I'm going to leave this. But that's what happens. You kind of formalize it by appointing people into these roles where their job is to come up with something that shows that they are taking these fears seriously.
Yeah, and what you were talking about before of, we do things that are risky. Skiing is risky. Jumping out of airplanes is risky. We choose to do them, and letting our kid walk ahead to soccer practice a couple of blocks is nobody else's business.
You'd think it was nobody else's business. And this is worrying. Over the last week while I've been talking to people around America about these issues, one of the things that's come up is this thing of people phoning 911 when they see a child left in a car seat while mom pops into the drugstore or something. And that this is now something that people are making their business. So I think there's a lot of urgency in us starting to get people to take a bit more of a measured response to risk and safety. And one of the ways we can encourage them to do that is to think about whether or not there's anything to back up all these anxieties.
And lastly, and because we talked about this last time, and I thought it was important that, what is this doing to kids? My son is 10, and he's much more cautious and aware of potential dangers than I ever was. One
of the things we've got to think about is how our kids are going to be as as they become older teenagers and go out into the world, if they've never been allowed to go and buy a bus ticket on their own. One of the things I've noticed a lot in the reading I've done around and the research for the book is that we've lost our sense of how we learn to negotiate risks. So we forget that we did it through experience. You can't be instructed in this stuff. You actually have to go out. You have to experience everything from rejection. You have to experience going to the store and the storekeeper giving you the wrong change and how you cope with an adult in that situation. You have to experience misjudging, stepping out into the street and only just having to jump back onto the sidewalk. And, you have to experience those things in order to get a measure of them. So it's kind of worrying that we've got a generation of kids who, in a practical way, are not engaging with the world enough. But also, emotionally, what's it doing to them? When you get a rejection letter, teachers were talking to us about this when we wrote the book. When you get a rejection letter from your first application for an apprenticeship or for going to college, how do you weigh that if you're not used to understanding that one bad incident does not, make your whole of the rest of your life? You've kind of just haven't got that resilience unless you've been able to understand things in their context a bit better. So I think our ability to understand risk and opportunities is really at risk here.
Well, it's really food for thought, because how often do we just accept the fact that, rules, well, we have rules because we need rules and they're making us safer when really, in fact, we have a lot of rules that just don't do anything. Thanks, Tracey. Tracey Browne has been my guest. She is the author of the book Playing by the Rules. There's a link to her book on Amazon.com on the show notes page for this episode of the podcast, which you will find at somethingyoushouldknow.net. Let me talk for a moment about Audible.com. If you like podcasts, my guess is you've had a chance to maybe check out an audiobook or two and see if you like it. Well, Audible.com has a deal, a risk-free deal. You can get a free audiobook download, any of their bazillions of titles, and give it a try and get 30 days free of their service and see what you think. If you like podcasts, you're going to like audiobooks. It's a great way to consume a book, which doesn't require your, visual attention. You can listen while you're driving or cooking or walking, or it's really a great way to consume books. And you can try it for nothing. Just go to audibletrial.com/SYSK for your free audiobook download and 30-day free trial. audibletrial.com/SYSK. audibletrial.com/SYSK. One thing that really interests me is how the smallest gesture of kindness can have such a huge impact on someone else. In my life, I like to try to help others, and I'm sure you probably do too. And the lasting impact you can have by practicing acts of kindness they're wonderful, and they feel good. They feel good not only to the person you're helping, but they feel good to you, the helper. It's such a great topic, and why I was glad to find Laura Schroff. She is author of the book Angels on Earth. I think this conversation it's going to make you feel good. Welcome, Laura. And so explain how you got involved in this topic and about the book, and just kind of bring us up to speed.
Well, Angels on Earth really came about because I came out with a book back in 2011, and the name of the book is An Invisible Thread. And an invisible thread is not only the name of my book, but it's an ancient Chinese proverb, how an invisible thread connects those people who are destined to meet. Regardless of time, place, and circumstance, the thread may stretch or tangle, but it will never break. In An Invisible Thread, I asked readers to share with me their own invisible thread stories. And I started to receive these incredible stories from all across the country and actually even around the world. People sharing their stories of how someone had made a difference in their life or how they made a difference in someone else's life.
And what is it? Do you think that when people have these experiences, they know it, or do they need you to kind of explain it and then they go, oh yeah, I guess I did do that?
Well, it's really interesting. I got quite a few emails from readers saying, I have this really amazing relationship, this friendship in my life. But thank you for actually giving it a definition, an invisible thread, because I really believe that we were destined to meet, but I just never knew it. So sometimes, they do need a definition. But other times it's people who just want to share their own stories with me and how they made this difference in someone else's life.
And so what's the so what here? I mean, so everybody's or lots of people have had these experiences, and therefore, so what?
Well, I like to call them my chapter angels, and there's 29 stories, and they're all very unique. They're all very different. And basically what they really do is talk about how we can really live happier and more purposeful lives through sharing acts of kindness. And, by sharing an act of kindness or by making a difference in someone's life, you don't have to change the world. You don't have to feed all of America. But if you take the time to stop and look at your own surroundings, sometimes you'll receive the most beautiful blessings in return.
It is interesting, and I've talked to other people and read a lot several books about this, about how the power of giving and what it does for the giver, not just the receiver.
Absolutely. And there's something really interesting about sharing kindness. That there's a chapter in the book, and it's The Helper's High. And it's by Dale Atkins. And she's kind of like a kindness expert, but research shows that when you give kindness, it's contagious. And the more you do it, the more you really want to do it. And it almost becomes part of your DNA. That when you do share kindness, it makes you feel good. So therefore, it makes you want to do it again.
Well, and what's seemingly so interesting in the experience so many of us have is that, I don't know if it's magic or what, but when you do kind things for other people, it's amazing how it comes back sometimes multiple times.
Well, yeah, and most people are not kind because they're looking for something in return. But the truth of the matter is, what you said, that word magical, there is something so magical when you reach out to another person and you realize that you actually made an impact, and some of these impacts are small and some of these impacts are huge. Some are life-changing for the moment, and some are life-changing forever. And
yet we sometimes have to be reminded to do this, because I guess maybe we're all so busy in doing our own thing that we if there's time, we'll try to do acts of charity or volunteer or do something that helps someone else. But it does seem to make its way down the list because life gets in the way.
Well, it's interesting because sometimes people do say, well, I'd really love to do something. I'd like to make a difference, but I don't have the time. And there is a story in the book, and it's the first chapter, and it's called The Hug, and it's by Drew Sanchez. And the reason why I opened up with this particular story is because it is such a simple story. It's about a woman being in a grocery store, and she saw a mother with 3 small children. And the young boy was holding a calculator. And as they were picking up items, he would put into the calculator the dollar amount. And the item would either go back on the shelf or it would actually go into the basket. And it brought her back to when she was a single mom and she was struggling. And she had a God wink, if you want to call it, and thought, you know what? I can make a difference. I can do something today. And so she went up and she bought a gift card. And she gave it to this family. Now, this gift card might have just fed the family for just a week. But what's interesting is I'm sure that family will never forget it because the gift that she got because of it was so amazing to her. And in many ways, it was life-changing. And yet there's other chapters in Angels on Earth where the gift was so much bigger. But it doesn't matter what you do. The difference is that we are all capable of making a difference.
Well, what's so interesting about and illustrative about that story is it's so easy to do what she did, and it doesn't take much to buy a gift card and hand it to somebody, and makes the person who gave it feel terrific for doing that. And as you say, the people who receive the gift card will remember it forever. And yet, for some reason, it is so easy to see that situation and turn away and walk away when you could easily do something so magical like that.
Yeah, Mike, when you think about today in the way we live, selfies. Everybody loves taking a selfie, and the selfie always usually includes that person. So take that camera and turn it outward and look outward instead of looking inward. And you know what? You can make a difference.
When people say, I wish I had more time, or I don't know what to do, or I don't know where to start, or, it sounds like something I'd really like to do, but what's your advice?
My advice is to say to them, you don't have to do anything that is so time-consuming or life-changing. It can be something as simple as when you walk into an elevator, saying good morning and having eye contact with that person. It can be something as simple as saying thank you to the person who helped bag your groceries at a supermarket. That when you start to incorporate those simple things that do make a difference into your lives, you'll see how kindness really is contagious and how you want it to be a part of your life.
Yeah, once you start, it's kind of hard to stop, I guess, in many ways. And that's why I guess people, when they start to volunteer or they do things, that it becomes, habitual. It's hard to stop doing it.
And sometimes when you start to do it, when I stopped that day and I bought Maurice lunch, I never could have imagined how the both of us, at that moment, our lives had changed. We had not know, but we did not know it. We didn't know that we had our own invisible thread connection, and we didn't know the impact that we were going to have on each other's lives. People would say to me all the time, wow, Maurice was so lucky to have you in his life. And I used to say, are you kidding me? I was so lucky to have had Maurice in my life. He gave me blessings that I never would have known had I not had the opportunity to stop that day and have him come into my life. And I think about how my life would be so different today if I hadn't turned around and I didn't go back.
So make the connection here for me, because you're talking about, this invisible thread where people have these connections in life that never break. But on the other hand, that lady in the grocery store, you'll probably never see again in your life. So that's really not a connection that is meaningful in the long term. So bridge that for me, because it almost sounds like we're talking about two different things.
Well, yes and no, because about the woman in the grocery store, because they ultimately never created a relationship, she doesn't not know the impact that she had on her. But that invisible thread connection that they had for that moment could have made a very big difference in her life and the things that she did. Now, there are people who come into our life, and there's a story, and it's called The Sweater, and it's chapter 12, and it's a working high school girl. Rather than buy a sweater, she saw an ad for the Christian Fund and decided to make a pledge of $15 a month for a needy child who lived in Guatemala. His name was Hippolito. And they communicated through mail. She dreamed that one day her donation would make a difference and that maybe he would become a doctor, but she knew she wasn't being realistic. But then, many years later, he got in touch with her, and he gave her the most extraordinary gift, because what she learned was this donation that she had given him for all those years did change his life. And, Eileen's story is a perfect example, again, of how there was this invisible thread connection. They were destined to meet. And it not only changed her life, but God knows it changed Hippolito's life.
So when the dust settles on all this, what's the message here? What are you trying to get people to either do or understand or grasp that maybe they don't?
I think that it's very simple, that by honoring and activating these invisible thread connections that come into our lives, we can all become an angel on earth. And I guess like Eileen, if I wanted to dream, I'd love to think that we all have the ability to become angels on earth. And imagine if that were the case, how much kinder a world we'd be living in.
Perfect. Perfect words to end the conversation. Laura Schroff, she's the author of the book Angels on Earth. Thanks so much, Laura.
Mike, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.
I've noticed over the last, a couple of years, I guess, stories in the news about airline passengers having to be restrained because, they do horrible things and they get into fights. And so I was interested to find an article in Business Insider, the website businessinsider.com, about flight attendants and how they deal with this. And according to the flight attendants they interviewed, flight attendants are always keeping their eye on people who seem to be ordering more than a few drinks and are maybe behaving a little too aggressively. They're trained to kind of keep their eye on those folks. So when they do identify a problem passenger, they communicate with each other so that the entire flight crew is aware and watching. And they cut off the drinks, and then they start to suggest to that person that maybe they drink some water, take a nap, do something that keeps them calm while they sober up. And if that doesn't work, they assess the behavior according to 3 threat levels. Level 3 is when the passenger begins touching or punching or kicking other people. At that point, the flight crew stops being polite and, often with the help of other passengers, forcibly restrain the passenger. Turns out that on every airplane there are body restraints, and the flight crew actually go through restraint training to make sure the passenger stays in his seat until he is escorted off the plane by the police. And that's something you should know. And that's the podcast today. I appreciate you listening. If you have a moment, I'd love it if you spend a moment or two and would go to iTunes and leave a review. And we'll have another episode for you very shortly. I'm Mike Carruthers. Thanks for listening to Something You Should Know.